The Nazi regime was built around a crusade, as they claimed, to save Germany. To this effect, the so-called Aryan race had to be preserved with only the purest blood in the Reich. Just as the terrible Spanish Inquisition did in the modern age, Nazis set out to exercise a strict control over the sexual behaviour of all the citizens, crossing every limit imaginable for a Western society in the 1930s. Nazism was a political religion with strange and contradictory conceptions about sex. On one hand, they had liberal opinions on sexuality, but at the same time they held very strong views on the role of women in a household. We will take a look at the Nazi views on marriage, pre-marital sex and homosexuality, as well as expose the hypocrisy of Nazi hierarchs regarding sex. Keep watching to learn the secrets of sex life in Nazi Germany. Welcome to the Marshal Memoirs. From the bed to the kitchen, women's sexuality in 1930s Germany. In order to control the sexual behavior of its citizens, the Nazis constructed a legend around the Weimar Republic as representing the total cultural and moral breakdown of Germany. The Weimar Republic, in place between the end of World War I and 1933, had attempted to promote civil freedoms in line with other liberal democracies of the West. Thanks to this, women in the 1920s and early 1930s experienced new freedoms in their public and private life. This phenomenon had already begun during the Great War, when many women went to work in factories and industries while their husbands were fighting at the front. During the Weimar Republic, women's access to work and to certain social habits such as smoking, attending bars or theaters, became an everyday thing. The Nazis saw this newfound freedom with horror, as they believed women's liberation and feminism to be ideologies that had no place within their ideal ethnic state. According to the Nazis, these were foreign ideologies that had nothing to do with traditional German values. Rather, they belonged to the Bolsheviks and the Jews and had to be stamped out. Hitler believed that the role of women in the improvement and expansion of the Aryan race would be fulfilled at home. Their patriotic duties were to raise morally outstanding children, support the husbands, and be good in bed to breed even more children. Pure Aryan women should procreate as quickly and as much as possible to populate all of Europe with Aryan Germans, raising the soldiers of the new and glorious Third Reich. The years before Hitler came to power were marked by an unprecedented economic and social crisis. In 1919, the average income for German citizens was 25% below that of the years before the war, and between 1921 and 1923, a brutal hyperinflation hit the country. At its peak, Germans needed 1 trillion marks to buy only $1. By the time Hitler was made Chancellor of the Reich, the economy was in shambles. The Nazis were very skillful in creating different scapegoats to explain the crisis, which explains the success of their political project. First, it was the communists, then the Jews, but to a lesser degree, Hitler also blamed the Germans' way of life throughout the Weimar Republic. In Hitler's view, the Weimar Republic was responsible not only for economic strife, but for a great cultural decadence that lasted years, which supposedly tainted the moral basement of the German people. According to the Nazis, because of the Social Democrats, Communists and Jews, women had left their natural place. The governments that preceded Hitler had masculinized women, turning them into voracious sexual monsters instead of the docile housewives they were supposed to be. Moreover, because they neglected their duties at home to find jobs, they aggravated male unemployment and forced salaries to plummet. There was no place in the Third Reich for the so-called double earners. A man's salary was supposed to be enough to support any family. One important aspect of the Nazis' political program was the necessity to re-educate women, including their sexual behavior. This would be achieved through a combination of state-sanctioned propaganda, private life surveillance through the Gestapo, and the collaboration of the common Germans. A full-scale effort to modify a society's way of behaving in private had never before seen in the history of humanity, and it was only comparable to the private surveillance and the terror deployed by the Inquisition between the 15th and 18th centuries, sexual depravity and racial laws. Since the enactment of the 1935 Nuremberg racial laws, Jews began to be excluded of all aspects of social and economic life in Germany. In fact, having sexual relations with a Jew was a worse crime than having children out of wedlock or prostitution. In order to reinforce this, Nazi Germany's secret police, the Gestapo, deployed a widespread surveillance apparatus, but it also counted on the collaboration of official and semi-official organizations as well as the individual initiative of Germans. These civilians acted as informants and constantly denounced this type of crime. Doctors, nurses, and even priests were known to routinely denounce women who confessed to having had relations with a Jew. For Hitler's followers, the Weimar Republic had not only perverted women's habits, but also the very notion of beauty for women and the conceptions of the ideal human body in general. The Nazis were notable worshippers of the human body, encouraging physical activity and the sports. Their foundational project for a new and better humanity included very defined concepts of beauty for both women and men. Guidelines were established for artists regarding how women should be represented in art. Not only they had to be white and slim, but they had to have deep blue eyes and perfect blonde hair, most times in a bun. Girls were mostly depicted in traditional Tyrolese clothes and with perfectly braided hair. The Nazis commissioned their artists to depict attractive naked women in natural settings, in evocation of the Adam and Eve story, but also pointing to the restoration of a primeval human nature, a return to roots. One of the artists to best encapsulate these principles was Ernst Liebermann. He had started his career in the early 20th century illustrating children's books by the Grimm brothers, but during the Nazi dictatorship, he made women his main subject matter. He often posed them suggestively, either wearing revealing gowns or classical Greek dresses. These were used as a nod to Nazi traditionalism and their pretensions of being direct descendants of the great civilizations of the past. On the other hand, everything that did not fall within the parameters of beauty demanded by the Nazis was catalogued as degenerate art or even as pornography. This goes to show how the Nazis, on the one hand, promoted a more liberal exhibition of the female body, but at the same time imposed a strict control of how it was to be represented. Elfriede Loose-Wechtler, a painter whose self-portraits and portraits of prostitutes were banned as degenerate art, began having mental issues as a result. In 1935, after his husband divorced her, she was declared insane and sent to an asylum, where she was forcefully sterilized and eventually murdered as part of Nazi eugenicist policies. At the center of the Nazis' ideal society stood the family. However, unlike other countries of Catholic and Protestant Europe, they did not condemn single mothers and children out of wedlock. This was because in their vision of expansion of the Third Reich, the Aryan Germans were to reproduce as fast as possible, much faster than Jews, Slavs, and communists in general. As long as the mother was a fit and pure-blood Aryan, she was protected and even encouraged to have children. The Nazi Party had promoted chastity among their members until 1934, but at the same time they encouraged in some of their civil associations, as in the meetings of the League of German Girls, pre-marital and even extramarital relations. In time, topics discussed in secret meetings of the League reached a status of general knowledge in German society. At this time, stories of the now famous meetings between the League of German Girls and the male divisions of the Hitler Youth surfaced. It was said that multiple sexual encounters took place during these meetings, and that sexual parties and orgies were common. After all, the Hitler Youth taught its members that sexual acts between a German man and a German woman were a direct service to the fatherland. Because of this, in the mid-1930s, German hospitals began to receive large numbers of pregnant teenagers, many of them younger than 15. They also received and treated adolescents with sexually transmitted diseases. Prudish or promiscuous, marriage and infidelity in Nazi Germany. The Nazis believed one of their providential missions was to restore the traditional German family, destroyed by years of neglect during the Weimar Republic. In their vision, family was the central institution from which Germany's reconstruction and expansion would start. In this respect, Hitler and his followers had a double standard. While they unashamedly promoted promiscuity among women, they also held strong views regarding marriage. SS leader and head of the Gestapo Heinrich Himmler claimed multiple times that traditional marriage was incompatible with the aspiration of the Aryans to reproduce rapidly and gain an advantage over the Slavic world. Hitler, as we will see shortly, was of the same opinion. However, this rejection of marriage was not extensive to all Nazis. Discursively, the Nazis defended monogamy and the Western ideal of a household with a wife, a husband, and several children. However, in private, the Nazis promoted that men, especially Nazi hierarchs, have several illegitimate lovers so that they could reproduce more easily and obtain a respite from the stresses at work and at home. Heinz Linger, a former SS officer, told in his memoirs of a rumor spread in 1942 that an officer in Adolf Hitler's inner circle had married a prostitute. The rumors had finally reached the Führer, who asked for the marriage to be annulled. This struck Linger as odd, considering how Hitler claimed in private that what people did in their bedrooms was none of his business, as long as what they do did not affect the Reich and its leadership. Ultimately, the questioned officer was not sanctioned and was allowed to continue having a relationship with his ex-wife, now turned lover. While greater pressure was placed on girls and women to uphold high moral standards and remain abstinent until marriage and faithful after that, men typically enjoyed more sexual privilege and looser moral restrictions when it came to their sexuality. The Nazi regime was not necessarily sexually repressive and was definitely pro-sex when it came to the reproduction of racially pure Aryan children or the Nazi male elite. In short, marriage was important to the Nazi regime only in discourse, while in practice it was not. The Nazis believed that the primary function of marriage was to conceive children. Neither love nor fidelity between the couple mattered much. The best marriage would be the one who provided the Third Reich with the most children of impeccable Aryan race. This is why the Nazis introduced a number of changes to the existing divorce laws in Germany. One such change was the possibility of dissolving marriages based on infertility or the refusal of a spouse to procreate. According to the Nazis, marriages that did not produce racially pure children were useless to the national community. If no children could be produced either by circumstance or by choice, a wife or husband had legitimate grounds to divorce their partner. A person could even demand a divorce from his or her partner. Their children were not pure enough for the race. Allegations of brutal sexual violence in the Third Reich, whether it was an increase in interpersonal surveillance that led to a spiral of denunciations or a general Nazi call for increased sexual activity. Reports of sexual crimes such as assault and other offenses rose sharply in the 1930s. From the beginning to the end of the decade, they increased by 50%. This in turn was made worse with the development of World War II due to the frequent separation between husbands and wives. Top officials like Himmler or those in the SS maintained pro-sex ideologies when it came to reproduction or meeting the sexual needs of soldiers. Sexual double standards show that men could satisfy their sexual needs and were encouraged to do so, while women faced repercussions for infidelity. German women who slept with prisoners of war directly threatened the purity of German blood, while their husbands abroad frequented brothels, slept with teenagers, or engaged in sexual liaisons with foreigners. In one case, a soldier filed for divorce in 1941 because his wife had an affair with a POW. The soldier blamed her for shameful behavior, claiming that she had deceived him horribly and left him a broken man. Women on the home front often had limited sexual contact or comfort because so many German men were away fighting. Having an affair with a POW was often the only option. Female sexual autonomy under the Third Reich was nearly unimaginable for some male party officials. However, women did find ways to meet their sexual needs, including girls in the League of German Girls, as discussed earlier. Ultimately, women were expected to remain chaste and loyal to their husbands and the fatherland, while soldiers enjoyed a range of sexual liberality and privilege. Nazi hierarchs had no objection to having affairs with married women, getting involved with them, and even forcing themselves in them. Emanuel Schäfer was an ordinary policeman who rose through the ranks of the secret police to the highest circles of the Third Reich. One of the keys to Schäfer's outstanding rise was his willingness to do dirty work. This was a highly rewarded asset in the Third Reich. The paradox lies in that Schäfer would end up being the victim of a confession as well. In October 1940, Schäfer was appointed head of the Cologne branch of Gestapo. He was in the prime of his career. It was a deserved reward for so many questionable operations he had done on Hitler's behalf. While in Cologne, Schäfer oversaw the first deportations of Jews. Schäfer was a married man with 3 children. He had fulfilled his mission to reproduce and populate Germany with Aryans. However, Schäfer had a B-side that would later cost him his life. He had entered into an adulterous relationship with a 24-year-old typist named Marianne, whom Schaefer took to work for the Gestapo. Marianne soon became his personal secretary when Schaefer was transferred at Hitler's request from Cologne to Belgrade. By this time, he and Marianne had already sent at least 3,000 Jews to their deaths. Sometime earlier, in August 1939, shortly before the outbreak of the war, Himmler and Hitler had ordered Schaefer to carry out one of the most important covert operations ever done by a private officer. The mission was to lead a company of SA stormtroopers dressed in Polish uniforms to attack the German radio transmitter at Gleiwitz in order to pretend that Poland had started the war against Germany. Schaefer's authorship of this mission had never been discovered until the husband of Marianne confessed everything. This man was a private who had fought on the front lines while Schaefer and Marianne were in Cologne deepening their bond. According to her testimony in front of the Cologne court in 1951, Marianne told her husband everything in 1941 when she returned from the battlefront. Marianne also told her husband that Schaefer had forced her to have sex with him while they were working in Cologne. She had no choice because he was her and could get her fired. According to her testimony, she was afraid to denounce Schaefer in court for fear of reprisals. It was not easy to accuse the head of the Cologne Gestapo for sexual assault. After her ex-husband's testimony, Schaefer was demoted and imprisoned. His transgression of the marriage rules backfired on him. Sex cells, use of sexuality in Nazi propaganda and cinema. The Nazis also heavily employed propaganda in the form of images, films, and other media-based sources in an effort to instill their ideals in the German population. Like other authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, the Nazis understood the potential of propaganda to have a significant influence on the private lives of citizens, including their sex lives. In their propaganda campaign, the Nazis highlighted their ideas regarding gender and sexuality. In order to induce women to embrace motherhood and domestic life, propaganda materials such as posters often depicted women as mothers, basking in the joys of raising a family. Women were frequently pictured breastfeeding a baby or surrounded by children in a traditional rural setting, which was meant to represent the Nazi fantasy of ideal family life. Men, on the other hand, were primarily depicted as soldiers prepared to go to war for the fatherland, emphasizing the values of heroism and self-sacrifice that the Nazis associated with masculinity. To symbolize the importance of family and racial purity, men with obvious Aryan characteristics were also included in pictures of perfect German families looking happy and healthy. The Nazis also published various kinds of propaganda literature in order to further indoctrinate the population. Specialized women's magazines that informed the reader about the joys of motherhood, gave marriage advice, and offered tips on how to manage the household were widely circulated. These magazines also included articles geared towards men, with titles such as The Happy SS Father. The Nazis also distributed pamphlets, created traveling art exhibits, and made radio broadcasts and public speeches to further promote their ideology on gender and sexuality. Therefore, it was evident that the Nazis employed a number of different mediums as tools in their propaganda efforts. But without a doubt, one of the most powerful instruments of Nazi propaganda was cinema. It was the favorite tool the regime had for transmitting their principles and values to the whole society. In no other totalitarian regime was such a strict control exercised on cinema as in the Nazi years. Nothing escaped the censor's eye of Goebbels and company. The Nazis' idea of love, relationships, and marriage can also be seen in the type of films aimed at young adults of marriageable age and in the famous romantic dramas. One of the most famous films of the time was Opfergang, or The Great Sacrifice from 1944. It was a story of unrequited love, but above all a portrait of how true Germans should behave regarding their relationships. Albrecht was an unfaithful man, married to a woman from an aristocratic family, but also in a relationship with a sporty and adventurous young woman. The film highlights the allure of extramarital relationships compared to how boring and routinary it was to have a classic marriage. The sexual tension between the three protagonists is present throughout the film, and the portrayal of Els, Albrecht's love interest, represents everything the Nazis stood for regarding feminine beauty. She was radiant, sporty, cheerful, delicate, with a beautiful face and a sculpted body. Els would be the villain in any other contemporary romantic dramas, However, in Nazi Germany she is not portrayed as such. Neither is she seen as a victim of her lover's manipulation. Instead, she is portrayed as a person who loves nature, who practices sports, who loves genuinely, and is in every way an outstanding member of the Reich. The love story between Els and Albrecht, as depicted in Opfergang, sums up the Nazi cultural system's idea of love, which was far removed from the institution of marriage, even though they frequently insisted on the importance of marriage. The cruel fate of homosexuals and lesbians. The Nazi ideology placed reproduction at the very center of human relations. Consequently, their system of values despised homosexuals, but also because of the Nazi idea of masculinity. For Hitler and his acolytes, masculine values such as courage and strength were a very important value in the construction of the Third Reich. Not to be afraid to go to war to protect the destiny of the German nation was, in Nazi ideology, associated to a very precise figure, that of a young man, strong, vigorous, who is fertile and can reproduce as much as he can, who actively establishes sexual relations with as many women as he needs, and who, above all, is heterosexual. Homosexuals that bore no children were, in consequence, a diluting factor in the Third Reich. The homosexual man was considered by the Nazis as a degenerate, a deviant, a sick person. 10,000 homosexuals were deported to concentration camps during World War II. Homosexuality, together with allegiance to communism, were among the two most common grounds on which a non-Jewish German could be denounced to the Gestapo. Permanent denunciation and civilian collaboration with the Gestapo show how accusations of homosexuality spiraled and increased during the 1930s. From the beginning of Hitler's rule to 1939, complaints increased by 900%. To bear the stigma of being denounced as a homosexual in Nazi Germany was synonymous with becoming a social outcast, something similar to being denounced as a heretic in the Spain of the Inquisition. In 1935, the Ministry of Justice performed a massive revision and rewriting of the criminal code. New language added as paragraph 175, specifically imposed up to 10 years of hard labor for indecency committed under coercion or with adolescents under the age of 21, and for male prostitution. Moreover, ministry officials and court decisions expanded the category of criminally indecent activities between men to include any act that could be construed as sexual. This meant that engaging in homosexual relations amounted to the same punishment as a sexual assault. Not only those accused of homosexuality lost their jobs, friends and family almost immediately, they also ran the risk of being sent to concentration camps, where they were often brutally murdered and forcefully castrated. Homosexuality in women seems to have been less of an issue for the Nazis, at least in terms of urgency. There were other populations that needed to be extirpated from German society first. The Nazis were much more concerned about women who did not procreate as a couple than they were about lesbianism. It is because of the profoundly masculine vision of the Nazi expansion project that lesbianism did not matter so much. In these terms, it seemed much more serious to be a man and a homosexual than to be a woman and a lesbian. After all, lesbians could very well bear children. Austria, for example, did have an anti-homosexual law that applied to women. In contrast, Germany's anti-sodomy legislation did not apply to women. But the sex regulation laws in Nazi Germany were gender-neutral and could be enacted against lesbians if it came to that. Moreover, the Gestapo could imprison people even without the need for a legal violation. It could also implement custody without recourse to the judicial system, and that could also lead to a person being sent to a concentration camp. Something like this happened to two women of the German Women's League in Nazi-occupied Poland. These were two women who were caught having a relationship, and one of them was sent to a concentration camp. While there was no open campaign against lesbians or even transvestites, many people in Nazi Germany were arrested, terrorized and subjected to horrific acts of both street and state violence because of their gender or sexual orientation. Erich Röhm, a case of Nazi sexual hypocrisy. Nazi speech often was quite a departure from their actual practices, and their attitudes toward homosexuals were not an exception. This was especially true of the higher officials, who had considerable freedom to do many of the things that were officially condemned. For once, they did not run so many risks of being imprisoned on homosexual charges as the ordinary German citizens. The most resonant case in this respect is that of SA Chief Erich Röhm, one of Hitler's closest figures and a central actor in the early years of Nazism. Erich Röhm's SA was a paramilitary shock force mainly responsible for hunting down Germans whose behaviour in public and in their private life did not conform to Nazi ideology. Countless workers and intellectuals accused of being communists, hundreds of Jews of all social classes, and of course, people accused or suspected of being homosexuals, passed through the jaws of Erich Röhm's fearsome SA. The SA was supposed to be an army composed of strong young men, embodying all the values of masculinity that the Nazis wanted to emphasize: vigor, strength, courage, boldness, manliness, commitment to Nazi ideology, and not being afraid to die. But the SA had a B-side, and that is that its own leader Erich Röhm was openly a homosexual. There are many sources confirming that Hitler himself knew about it and chose to ignore it, or did not think it was worth discussing. In 1931, an extreme left-wing newspaper revealed that Röhm, the manly leader of the ferocious SA, practiced homosexuality. This news again did nothing to shake the relationship between Röhm and Hitler. Moreover, when Hitler was finally able to confirm Röhm's homosexuality, the leader of the Third Reich played it down as a minor issue. In 1932, Röhm was accused of seducing one of Hitler's men. Upon learning of this episode, the Führer attributed Röhm's homosexuality to a passing illness that he had contracted during his stay in the tropics, especially during the period in which Röhm was in charge of organizing the Bolivian armies. At that time, Hitler claimed, almost justifying the SA leader's homosexuality, that Röhm's sexual life belonged to the private sphere and was of no public interest. It was only when the SA grew in power and began to collide with the SS, and even with the Nazi power project itself, that Hitler decided to get rid of Röhm. While Himmler claimed that Röhm's fall from grace had to do with his homosexuality, the reality was that Röhm's parapolice force had become an awkward player in the Third Reich's balance of power. The SA mobilized the ordinary German, the middle-aged heterosexual man who wanted to get involved in the refoundation of society and who was willing to give his all. The SA represented, in a way, the left wing of Nazism, a sector that in times of the bureaucratization of Nazism, when the state fused with the party, could not be tolerated. The parapolice forces had to be eliminated, and the excuse of Röhm's homosexuality came as a perfect fit for Himmler and company. This is why Himmler ordered the SS alongside the Gestapo, the secret police, to enforce a brutal purge within the party. The bloodbath that ensued between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934, became known as the Night of the Long Knives. Together with Röhm, as many as 150 people might have been killed and hundreds were arrested and tortured. The dangers of being trans in the Third Reich. There are not many sources that mention trans people in the Third Reich. This does not mean that they did not exist, only that they were not acknowledged as such, being mostly designated in official papers either as male or female. The case of Ilse Totzke is enlightening in this sense. Totzke committed the crime for which she was sent to a concentration camp in the middle of the night of February 28, 1943, when she climbed over a wire fence on the German-Swiss border with Ruth Basinski, a 27-year-old Jewish kindergarten teacher whom she had met through a mutual friend the previous fall. Totzke, who was then 30 years old, had helped Basinski slip away from the detention facility in Berlin where she was being confined in preparation for her impending deportation. That night at the border, Totzke and Basinski had bad luck. Swiss border guards caught them and turned them over to the Gestapo. They never saw each other again. Basinski was sent to Auschwitz. Totzke was transferred to the custody of the Gestapo in Würzburg, the conservative, predominantly Catholic city in Bavaria, where she had lived most of her adult life. For the Würzburg Gestapo, Totzke was an old acquaintance, having already been investigated for some illegal behaviors between 1939 and 1942. These investigations had one factor in common: the accusation that she did not fit into the parameters of what a woman should be. The only surviving evidence in this regard is a series of photographs from the Gestapo archive showing her wearing a suit, jacket, tie, and Nazi-style haircut. In a report sent to the Gestapo in 1942, a local officer noted that she often went around in men's clothes. She wore trousers, something highly irregular in women at the time. From the chest up, Totzke's style is quite similar to that of Lotte Harm, a prominent lesbian and transvestite activist during Germany's lesbian, gay, male, and transvestite political and social renaissance of the 1920s. However, there is not enough evidence to assert that Totzky was indeed a transvestite. If anything, she could be confidently deemed a crossdresser. On May 2, 1942, an anonymous letter with an accusation against Totzka arrived at the Gestapo offices, which informed that Totzka maintained a very intimate friendship with a 15-year-old Jewess named Schwabacher. Mrs. Schwabacher, the alleged 15-year-old's mother-in-law, did not approve of her visits according to the letter. Totzka seemed not to have a normal orientation, one that she imposed on the young and impressionable woman. The accuser, who may well have been Mrs. Schwabacher herself, even claimed that Totzka had turned the young girl into a man-hater. An investigation into this most irregular matter was immediately enacted, but not for the reasons denounced in the letter. The letter pointed to the illegality of the relationship with Schwabacher, but she was not a teenager. She was Elsa Schwabacher, the Aryan wife of a Jew who had left Germany to escape to America. For a long time, the Gestapo thought Elsa Schwabacher was Jewish, but the Gestapo did not consider lesbian seduction a big problem. They did nothing with the anonymous letter at the time, beyond filing it away. However, the Totzka affair does show that the Gestapo was more concerned about Totzka's alleged connection to Jews than her lesbianism. This is demonstrated by the two interrogations that the Gestapo made to her in October 1941, in which they insisted that she reveal her Jewish convictions and paid little attention to her cross-dressing or to her alleged lesbian relationship with Schwabacher. The second Gestapo officer who interrogated Totzka was even harsher, citing the anonymous letter accusing her of being a lesbian, but the officer didn't really care if they were lovers. He cared that Totzka was violating an anti-Semitic law and refused to believe Totzka's claim that Schwabacher was an Aryan. After that interrogation, the report sentenced that Totzka would be warned, and that if there was another allegation of her connection with Jews, she would be sent to a concentration camp. Here again, no mention of her clothing and sexual choice. Sex-crazed teenagers of the swing movement. An interesting cultural phenomenon known as the swing movement appeared in nightclubs in the mid-1930s and quickly spread to almost every large and medium-sized German city. Swing clubs, especially in Hamburg in the 1940s, attracted young people from the upper echelons of Nazi society who experienced a romantic desire for adventure and a certain non-conformism towards the rigidity of regime life. Swing was a predominantly upper-class movement and was influenced above all by English culture. Swing boys and girls gathered in cocktail bars and nightclubs and sometimes organized parties in their own family homes. They chose pretentious, provocative clothing, flirted openly, and danced wildly. The boys wore tailored suits, often of a smart tartan, sport coats, felt hats, white silk scarves, closed umbrellas, and long hair. The girls wore heavy makeup, painted their nails, wore short skirts for the time and sexy blouses, and also let their hair grow long. Party authorities regarded this youth movement with astonishment, but also with caution, since it was an upper-class movement. The Nazis disliked its English influences and its overly global character. They also resented its cult of sexuality and scruffiness, its tolerance or indifference to Jews, and its fondness of American music, which, according to the Nazi leadership, was of black and Jewish influence. The first ordinance banning swing dancing was enacted in the city of Düsseldorf in November 1937, when the BEI Tony cocktail bar was forced to prohibit swing dancing. Other municipalities were encouraged to take similar measures over the next 2 years, so that by the summer of 1939, swing dancing had been effectively banned in most German cities. The decision by the municipalities was not an easy one, considering that it was one of the few times that Aryan Germans from wealthy or professional backgrounds were affected. But the authorities had commissioned the Hitler Youth and other Nazi organizations to prepare reports on the swing lifestyle. These reports condemned the young swingers above all for their lack of patriotic sentiment and their non-conformism with the system. But above all, they reported many details about their sexual practices. These practices were, for the Hitler Youth, against the ideal way of life, that is to say that they perverted the true German Aryan feeling, and that is why it was necessary to fight them. The reports stigmatized the young swings in their sexual preferences. The informants of the Hitler Youth described how the swing boys and swing girls practiced polygamy, orgies, sex with or among minors, and what most generated aberration in the public opinion, tolerance and sex with Jews. Clearly, the swing lifestyle in a context of war against England and the United States went against the folkish sentiment proposed by Nazism. In spite of being a movement of high class and not being accused of Jewish or communist origin, the main axis of criticism towards the swing was the sexual promiscuity. But again, this was a secondary concern, the main one being that the swing movement was tolerant towards the Jews. The Gestapo, when it came to adolescent sexuality, was much more concerned about the Jewish involvement than the promiscuity factor. The counter to the swing movement were the young people of the Hitler Youth. To swing boys and girls, the Hitler Youth were seen as boring kids, too obedient to the rules, and tried to avoid them as much as possible. Many young people in the swing movement had managed to avoid joining the ranks of the Hitler Youth thanks to their high societal positions. Their rejection had less to do with the extreme right-wing political ideology, which the swing boys and swing girls cared little for, and more to do with their dull, stiff lifestyle. The Hitler Youth were not exempt from engaging in sex as mentioned earlier, but as if it were a political religion, they did it not so much for pleasure but rather for a higher mission, to fill the whole of Europe with Aryans. In other words, sex for the Hitler Youth did not mean the pursuit of individual pleasure, but rather the fulfillment of duty. They had an almost military view of sexual practice. Eva Braun married to evil. Even more than other dictators, Hitler's sexuality has often been discussed by historians, mainly because it was a mystery. Stalin, for example, seems to have had a boring sex life, while Mussolini had a quite extensive reputation as a seducer of women. In fact, when Mussolini was killed and hanged upside down at a town square, he was with his mistress and not his official wife. Hitler, on the other hand, had such a smoky sex life that many contradictory things have been said about it. Little is known about his sex life, since for a long time the Führer cultivated both a seductive image calculated for young women and an ascetic image regarding his private life. In January 1937, a young man named Reinhard Spitzy, personal advisor to the German ambassador in London, Joachim von Ribbentrop, accompanied his boss to a meeting with Hitler. Spitzy was already a member of the SA and the SS. To him, Hitler was everything, a hero, a legend. He adored and idolized him. Spitzy stood like a statue while Hitler and Ribbentrop talked for 2 hours. Suddenly, during this conversation, a young girl with blonde curls appeared behind the door and scolded Hitler. "Come and have lunch with our guests at once, it's about time," she demanded. Spitzy was dumbfounded. He could not believe that someone would address the Führer like that. Bruckner, Hitler's well-known assistant, asked Spitzy to keep quiet about everything he had observed or his life would be in danger. He sympathetically explained that Hitler, although the Führer of all Germans, was also entitled to a private life. The young Reinhard Spitzy was shocked. He had always imagined Adolf Hitler as a person beyond worldly desire, beyond the passions of the flesh. He saw Hitler as a totally ascetic figure, completely dedicated to the task of working for the German people. That day he discovered that Hitler had a mistress, which meant he was sexually active. Sometime earlier, Hitler had attended a meeting of the National Socialist Women's Association in 1936. There he gave a speech in which he admitted that he could never have led the party to triumph without the perseverance and loving dedication of women to the movement. He added that those women that had the Nazi movement in their hearts were united to the Führer forever, and the children born from those women gave meaning to his work. Those children, he claimed rather grimly, belonged to their mothers just as much as they belonged to him. Hitler was then proposing a spiritual marriage to all women, especially those who could procreate who lived in Nazi Germany. The Führer demanded that all women take an oath. In this oath he demanded surrender, eternal union, and that the children belonged to him, and thus to the entire Third Reich. Beyond propaganda, Hitler was also trying to give an explanation about the real reason for his bachelorhood. Since all German women wondered about his sentimental life, the real reason would have been explained at a tea party at his headquarters in East Prussia in January 1942. When asked why he had not married, Hitler explained that because of his demands as head of the Third Reich, a wife would have been a burden for him. There, Hitler also added that the bad thing about marriage is that it creates legal obligations for which he had neither the time nor the inclination. Hitler was famously averse to marriage, which he considered an obtuse and outdated custom. For Hitler, it was much better to have one or several lovers. The legal obligation is dispensed with, and only the beauty of a relationship remains. Hitler's strong sentiments against marriage explain why, until the very end of their lives, he denied this possibility to Eva Braun, who asked him to get married on multiple occasions. Eva embodied Hitler's ideal of natural womanhood. A true blonde, she was athletic and sporty, she practiced gymnastics and swimming and kept herself in shape. She was emotionally immature and easy for Hitler to manipulate. Hitler's refusal to marry Eva Braun had nothing to do with her, nor that he wanted to hide her from society. Hitler did not believe much in marriage and believed that having a wife could make him vulnerable. In 1932, deeply unsettled by the Führer's disinterest and frequent absences, Eva tried to take his own life. Leaving a scribbled farewell note, she put the gun to her head and pulled the trigger. She missed. During the final days of the war, as the Soviet army was fast approaching Berlin, Hitler, Eva, and other Nazi commanders retreated to underground bunkers. Feeling the end draw near, and as a token of appreciation for Eva's many years of unwavering support, Hitler conceded her a long-standing wish of her own. Hitler made his personal secretary, Martin Bormann, conduct a small civil ceremony where he married Eva. The ceremony took place in an enclosed concrete environment. It didn't matter. The following day, they would be dead. Since coming to power in 1933, Hitler strived to build a new and improved German society, according to his racist and cruel ideals. He dreamed of controlling every aspect of his citizens' life, including their sex life. The ideal Aryan German was strong, fit, sexually active, heterosexual, and prolific, but even him had contradicting thoughts on sexuality. He publicly condemned homosexuality, but appointed gay men in prominent positions of the SA and SS. While sex was supposedly only for procreation, it was encouraged among the men and women of the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. And while Hitler spoke often and ardently against marriage, he ended up marrying his lifelong partner. This may have been his last social interaction, barely hours before taking his own life.